Okay, so what's happening during the High Middle Ages is also affecting art. So I'm going to take a few moments for us to enjoy the not so bloody, not so wary, not so, that was not cool, guys, right? Medieval art and architecture. So first of all, your ideas of medieval churches as whitewashed stone austere places, that's not correct. They would have been highly, highly decorated and painted, but the Victorians thought it was gaudy, and so they whitewashed it. So it's the Victorians' fault that everything looks white, because in fact it was super colorful. Excuse me. And the architecture of this moment is the Gothic arch. And I think this is one of the most interesting ways in which art and design can affect or instantiate ideas, because the function of the Gothic arch, the aesthetic of it, is literally when you walk into an arched cathedral, it is supposed to be massive and imposing and the biggest thing you've ever seen, right? Imagine you live in a town with like mud and cob houses, right? And there is a castle for the king, but you don't have access to that. So this is the biggest, most impressive, and possibly only stone building that you have access to as a peasant. And you walk in and you have these beautiful, high, vaulted ceilings. And the point of the Gothic arch is a point, right? Like literally, point. Here it is. But the point is to draw your attention up to God, right? Like when you enter a Gothic cathedral, that is what your eyes do. You enter and you're like, whoa. And one of the key features of this is to make you feel the distance between yourself and God. You are all the way down here. And that arch, that amazing, imposing arch, which is the biggest structure you've ever seen in your life, it is up there, and God is that much higher, right? Like God is even higher than that. Like the arch is almost unreachable. That's the point of a Gothic arch. Pun not really intended, but kind of funny anyway. So that's the architecture. And Gothic takes over from Carolingian with the geometric period. And I find this succession of art history to be kind of interesting because first they're like, okay, yeah, circles are good. Circles, some nice like angles and divisions. That's a geometric period. So they're very influenced by that like Roman rationality. And then it moves on to like fancy stuff. This is the flamboyant Gothic. What you're looking at here is York Minster, which actually has a mix of styles. And the reason that that's interesting is because it takes 500 years sometimes to build a cathedral. So you can see one cathedral and it will employ all these different forms of Gothic, which is kind of amazing. So anything you see that looks elvish, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, that is inspired by flamboyant Gothic, right? This is York Minster Cathedral in York. And then shit gets morbid because plague. Oh, what happened to my slide? Anyway, it's supposed to say plague. Anyway, the key thing is the plague hits and it kills like everybody. Like at least the estimates differ, but between 1 and 2/3 of Europe. So that leads to a kind of like morbid sensibility in the late Middle Ages. This is a common genre called the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. And the key idea here is everybody dies, don't forget. Even if you're a king or a bishop or a peasant, you're all headed to the same place, right? The grave. Very macabre. And that produces perpendicular Gothic. Isn't that great? Like art. Art is influenced by the plague. So the features of perpendicular Gothic are stark, right? The color kind of disappears and the intensity amplifies. So key features, not that important, but you have more of these little rows of windows that belong under one arch, right? So the arches kind of grow wider. They're a little less straight at God, which does kind of bring those ceilings down a little bit. And with the fan vaults, that's what this interior architecture is called, is the fan vault. It kind of looks like ribs, and so you're like inside a corpse. Super dark. This is King's College in Cambridge. It gives you an idea of what that perpendicular Gothic looks like on the outside. It's like very, very vertical, right? It emphasizes the verticality. So you remember this, farther back than I expected. This window, right? You're like, yeah, there's a lot of vertical going on here, but then there's a lot of this flamboyance, right? Look at how much we lose, how much of that we actually lose. Hang on, we have to march through death. When we look at the perpendicular Gothic, that spot where the little burst of joy happens shrinks, and the perpendicular grows, and the like rib caginess of it increases, right? So all the space that would have been used for a flamboyant Gothic arch is shrunk to here, and the perpendicular increases. And look at these, same thing, same ratio. This, by the way, is the inside of this building. So this is the Abbey in Bath. So what's the legacy of all this? That's the question. We talked earlier about how modernity defines itself as being totally separate from the concerns of the pre-modern or the Middle Ages, right? But what we actually see when we look at the historical details is there's a lot from the Middle Ages that carries forward. And this is something that we should probably pay some attention to. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the way that, Okay, so we're going to go on back to our discussion of succession. And we're like, yeah, okay. So we've got these wars, we've got some shit going on. And then, so we've got 100 Years' War, we have a crisis of succession, and we have two houses. And what ends up happening there is those two houses are pretty much equidistant from the throne, right? And nobody actually knows who's the best successor. And just literally right after the 100 Years' War ends, the War of the Roses begins in the 14th century. So they're just constantly fighting in England. And what that ends up meaning is that it is very difficult to establish a peace or arts and culture until that war ends by the marriage of the House of Lancaster, that's the red rose, to the House of York, that's the white rose, and then you have the House of Tudor. So we like to laugh at Henry VIII because we're like, oh my God, all those wives, what is wrong with that guy? But he is the first Tudor king to be born, and he can't produce an heir, and he just came out of generations of warfare over succession, right? So maybe we can contextualize his like need for a male heir within that a bit, because his oldest, Mary, and then Elizabeth, and then Edward. Remember, we talked about the youngest son, or the youngest child, who was the first son he inherited. And then it went to the eldest daughter, and she was Catholic, right? And it just went back and forth, and it was super bloody. The wars of the Reformation, the wars with the inter-Christian warfare completely dissolved that whole, yeah, it's okay to kill non-Christians distinction, because each side thought that they were the only right kind of Christian, right? The Catholics are the only true Christian. And so it is okay to kill Protestants. And Protestants are like, no, Catholics got it all wrong. They've corrupted the original message. And so it's okay to kill them because they're not really Christians. That is the justification for them killing each other for generations again. But now they're not doing it based on succession. They're doing it based on religion. And this resolves when Elizabeth, she ends up, her throne ends up going to the House of Stuart, who happens to be the King of Scotland. And that actually is how England and Scotland are unified. Like, not through warfare, but just because Scotland maintains its independence, and aristocracy are all intermarried, like all over Europe. I think we mentioned last time that Mary's married to Philip of Spain, and that's why she's Catholic, and whatever. So they're all married to each other. But other contextual reference is during the reign of Henry VII is when we have the beginning of the colonization of the Americas, right? 1492, that's when Columbus is happening. And then England jumps right on that in 1497 and sends Cabot to North America. So that is when the interaction between England and the colonies begins, and North America, I should say. House of Stuart. So this actually does impact our lives even today because of the legacy of many of these practices. We talked a little bit about Chivalry, and that is a form of irregular warfare. So this is what constitutes irregular warfare: extirpative warmaking, or warmaking that is designed to exterminate the people against whom you are fighting. This was definitely true against the Indigenous Americans, but also a part of Chivalry. So now we can see that the legacy of crusades is carried forward in a number of ways. So we also have specialized units, right? A smaller army that can't participate in regular warfare, and so it targets non-combatants. In North America, this is what the original frontiers force was like. This was settlers who became rangers who harassed local indigenous peoples, right? This is modeled off of the free companies of the 100 Years' War. And the word ranger gets used specifically to describe this practice as it's happening in Scotland several centuries earlier, right? And the last component of this is that this warfare is privatized and commercialized. So mercenaries? What? Who? No, we don't use mercenaries. So the bounties that are paid for scalps in North America are directly related to the practice of war guild, and scalping as a war practice is actually initiated in Ireland, right? So the legacy of medieval forms of warfare and the doctrines of it's okay to kill non-Christians directly impact the formation of settler colonies in the Americas. And I want to make sure that we connect those dots. So the colonization of Scotland is the first version of this. The English monarchs are always trying to acquire Scotland. The House of Stuart ends up unifying it briefly, but as soon as the Stuarts are no longer the monarchy, it becomes a problem again, right? And this goes all the way back to Rome. And even today, Scotland has its own parliament and wants to stay aligned with the EU, even as Britain is leaving it. And so they may actually vote for their independence. So that's a thing. We're going to leave the House of Stuart out, right? And when it wasn't aimed at Scotland, then it was aimed at Ireland, right? I don't know if you took note of this when we were looking at the Angevin Empire, but here we are in Ireland. But even before Henry, the Normans were already colonizing Ireland. And so this is the Norman colonization of Ireland, and then this is the continued colonization. And I want to make sure that we're clear. These are called plantations. That is where our terminology comes from, right? And that's where even some of our language that we use today, like if you've heard the phrase beyond the pale to describe something that's just like really unbelievable, that is describing a colonial situation in Ireland where this land belonged directly to the English king, and what was happening beyond it was uncivilized, savage. That's literally the word that they use to describe native Celts, savage. So these guys that succeeded the throne, right? Here's Henry, and then here's Mary, and then how we go on down into the English Renaissance. They're not actually any better, right? They are still involved in the conquest of Ireland, and specifically the use of unlimited warfare to subdue the heathens. And at the center of the English military solution to this, quote, problem of Ireland was a dependence upon terrorism and the indiscriminate killing of non-combatants. And I will point out that terrorism is a part of the struggle in Ireland still. The Irish Republican Army, or the army that is attempting to liberate Ireland from British colonial rule, is known for its terrorist attacks, especially in Northern Ireland, which is still under the control of Britain. This used to be a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it is also a sovereignty conflict. And part of the strategy involved here is a deeply colonial mindset that gets honed in Ireland before it is brought over to North America, right? So there are some key things that go on in Ireland that allow for the English kind of perfect colonization in this sandbox before they take it elsewhere. First is the idea that, Ireland is there for their exploitation. Second is that they use the division between Protestants and Catholics to their advantage. Third, Ireland doesn't have a military, right? Like, they've never been involved in any of these military skirmishes up to this point. Like, they don't even get touched by Rome, right? So they've never had a need for a military, especially not a unified one. And then so what they end up doing is it becomes a place where the rules of morality don't apply because it's a colonial frontier space, right? And so that makes it okay to flout the morality that you espouse in other areas. So to make this point, like, we have a Renaissance philosopher who says, non-combatants are not legitimate targets for armies. And he may be writing this because of the very bloody inter-Christian warfare that killed 8 million people in his home country, Germany, right? But that doesn't apply when you're talking about savages. So in the 18th century, the war in the Scottish Highlands was allowed to be brutal and ruthless because it was a fight against wild and barbarous Highlanders, Scottish Highlanders. The same thing was applied to the Irish. Same thing was applied to the indigenous people of the Americas. Plus, they used the people who have just benefited from the colonization of Ireland to colonize the rest of their spaces. So they colonized Scotland. And when Scotland has a large established native Protestant population, because Scotland, of course, it was also Catholic for a very long time. And once those folks become kind of anglicized, if you will, those are the people. They are not the aristocracy. They're kind of like middling in this mercantile class, yeomanry. So private landowners, but not feudal ones. So what's happening to the economy at this moment is you have emerging mercantilism because feudalism is kind of disintegrating, especially as there is this competition for luxury goods, right? And with all this warfare and whatever, the structures of feudalism are not as rigid as they used to be. And so you have the merchants who are making a lot of money, merchants and artisans, I should say, making a lot of money, supplying the aristocracy, the expanding aristocracy with their luxury goods. They get rich and then they try to become aristocracy, right? Because they want to elevate their status. And then you also have the yeomanry, which are private landowners who eventually become gentlemen landowners, who own their own land and then have other people work it, but they own less land. They're not rich, they're just self-sufficient, so they kind of exist in a middle space as well. Eventually, under capitalism, the idea of private property will really take root, and this yeomanry and mercantile class will merge into a kind of middle class that you could probably call the bourgeoisie. So that's who ends up being Protestant in Scotland, and that they are not nobility, but they get sent to Ireland and they can become nobility by participating in the colonization of Ireland well enough to be rewarded with a plantation of their own. Yay! So that's what you actually see happening in red here, are plantations that are established over time. So the sort of darker and browner they are, the older, right? And then these folks, notice Northern Ireland, which is still the site of British occupation today. These spaces, they intermarry, and the people that they become are the Scots-Irish. And those folks also are in a middling way. They're not exactly peasant laborers, but they are pretty close. And they think that they are better than the native Irish, and so they also want to have their own land, and that is the core group of like the workforce of American colonization. So the aristocracy comes over, yes, and they're in charge. That's how you get a class division between white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs, and the aristocracy who is in charge of colonization. And then the vast majority of the labor is actually from the Scots-Irish, right? So this is the era, look at that, 17th century, where we start to see that the practice of reducing an entire population via either submission or starvation is really honed and cultivated in Ireland, and then they will export that to North America. And particularly the people who were subject to that submission or starvation order, they end up becoming the ones who turn around and subject Indigenous Americans to that same brutality, right? And I also want to highlight that, yes, these folks often end up in the Americas as indentured servants because they think that, okay, I can do 7 years of labor and then I can have my own land, which is just repeating the process that has been played out in Scotland and then Ireland already. But also, one of the things that ends up happening is slavery in North America is not yet codified as explicitly racial and referring only to enslaved Africans. Indigenous folks are enslaved and brought back to Europe. That's how we got to Squantum or Squanto, with knowing how to speak English. But then it's also what they realize is that by importing these two classes of laborers, you had the danger of solidarity, right? So they're both in servitude of different varieties, but you don't actually get the establishment of their different statuses. You don't get the establishment of their different statuses based on race until Bacon's Rebellion, and that's actually much later in North America. And what it essentially is that Bacon is an aristocrat. He's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and he wants the government of Virginia to take a different stance about the indigenous people on the frontier, and to try to overthrow what they're doing, he actually unites the indentured servants and the enslaved Africans under one banner, who are also like, oh, well, obviously it is to our benefit for the racial animus of this government to be oriented towards the Indigenous Americans and not towards us. And so he creates an alliance. He manipulates an alliance between the Scots-Irish and the enslaved Africans. And they stage a rebellion, and it is almost successful, right? And what ends up happening as a result is the Virginia aristocracy is like, oh shit, it is bad if all of the workforce figures out that they have more in common with each other than they do with us. And so they rebel and overthrow us because there just aren't that many. It was a real close shave, I should say. So this is when the Virginia aristocracy establishes the difference between white and black enslaved folks, because what they essentially do is they extend the term, as a punishment for participating in this rebellion, they extend the term of indentured servitude for the Scots-Irish, and they encode into law the indefinite lifelong servitude of the enslaved Africans, and specifically write that their children will also be enslaved, right? They're born into slavery. And so the differentiation between poor whites and enslaved blacks begins here, specifically to prevent them from being in solidarity with one another as two forms of a working class. So there's a lot going on there that still impacts our society today. What I want us to leave this class with, and why I think it was worth taking the time to kind of hash it out at the end of this long, difficult semester, I know, is that when we separate ourselves from the historical past, we essentially say we are not like that. We say, oh, we're modern, and that isn't. And then we apply that terminology to other parts of the globe. And we say, oh, we white Europeans are modern. And those people haven't quite caught up. Remember, we talked about that time equals progress model of history. It assumes that everybody is heading the same direction, and that the direction they're heading is towards what we are like, right? We're modern and everybody is modernizing. They're just not as caught up with us. And that is the language that is used to justify global colonization, right? That what Europeans are doing is civilizing uncivilized parts of the world. And so we come back around to this question that has been troubling us all semester, the study of Western civilization. What is civilization, and what does it mean to use civilization as the defining feature of a society, right? And if Western colonial, capitalist, racist models, if that is modernity, then what are we highlighting as the ultimate priorities of our culture, right? So the other thing that I wanted to highlight is there's a certain amount of like collective amnesia that this allows us to do, right? We're allowed to say, oh, we're not like that because we're modern, and we can ignore the parts of our culture that are continuing to practice some of these same same elements. And most particularly, I want to end by pointing out that this form of warfare of targeting non-combatants and its roots in the US in the genocide of the indigenous people, that form of warfare is still built into the way that our military currently operates today. Irregular warfare is the norm. It is regular, right? It's just not, we don't go to Congress and declare a war and have them declare a war and fund it, and we send troops everywhere we're going. We've done that in a few places, but a lot of times what we do are drone strikes and SEAL teams and CIA operatives. And that is the same kind of irregular warfare that the country is rooted in, with settler rangers and paying bounties for the scalps of Indigenous people. The state of California paid over $1 million for the bounties of Indigenous natives. Right, that's a lot of money in the 19th century. The term redskin, which is a racial slur used to describe Indigenous people, according to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, actually comes from what white settler scalpers, bounty hunters, would call the mutilated corpses of their victims. So we have this legacy as a part of our modern, not at all distant past. And it lives on even in the terminology that we use in our military. So not only did we practice genocide against Indigenous Americans, but then we decided to use the names of their people and their heroes and their tribes for our military operations and machines, right? As Dunbar-Ortiz calls them, there are killing machines. So we have Black Hawk helicopters and Tomahawks and Apaches and Thunderbirds. As a person living very close to Nellis Air Force Base, that one really resonates here. But even the operation to assassinate Osama bin Laden was codenamed Geronimo, right? We still incorporate Indigenous language and people and culture, but we do it in a way that very clearly marks our conquest over those cultures. And yet, Indigenous Americans, they have the highest rate of enlistment in the U.S. military. And so we have this set of circumstances in which all of these histories are twisted up together. Some of them are heroic, some of them are complicated, and some of them are downright brutal. And none of them are non-modern. So what I'd like for everybody to contemplate as we are concluding our class is, what does it mean for us to define this time period, but also this culture as modern, right? And by this I mean the ones we live in, and others as not, right? And more particularly, the way that time distinction gets projected onto other spaces where maybe that periodization doesn't make any sense. Or more precisely, that periodization reduces the people in those regions from the status of humanitas to anthropos. And that is going to conclude the lecture work that we are doing together.